The following podcast series is a production of Building Bridges of Asheville, North Carolina. This series presents in-depth discussions examining systemic racism in the Asheville area and the triumphant stories of Black citizens. On today's episode, our host, Building Bridges co-chair Stephanie Jones-Byrne, is joined by Fletcher, North Carolina Mayor Preston Blakely as they examine systemic racism in housing.
Preston Blakely, thank you so much for talking with us, for being on the Building Bridges Session 59 panel, where we were talking about growing up in Asheville and housing in particular. And thank you for spending a little bit more time with us for this extra episode that we'll share with people of a new series. So I just want to start by having you just tell us a little bit about your background and what you are doing today. I'll have you introduce yourself and a little bit about your journey, who you are and how you got here.
Sure. My name is Preston Blakely. I'm currently the mayor of Fletcher, North Carolina, just south of Asheville in Henderson County. Prior to being mayor, I was elected to town council representing District 2. So did that for 2 years, and the current mayor decided he didn't want to run for re-election. So I decided to run, and I won. And just this past November, I was sworn in December. So this role's still new. It's been a great transition so far, and I'm learning. Nevertheless, I was born in Asheville. My family has generations and generations of roots here in West North Carolina. My mother's side of the family, those roots go back to Madison County, where my ancestor, Joseph Anderson, or Joe Anderson, was an enslaved man. He was enslaved by, I think, an individual on the board of directors that was founding Mars Hill College. The board of directors had a debt, and they weren't able to pay the debt, unfortunately. And Joe Anderson ended up being taken as collateral on the debt. So the sheriff from Asheville, I think Buncombe County, spanned out to where Madison County is currently at that time, if I'm not mistaken. I may be mistaken, but the Buncombe County sheriff came to where Joe Anderson was, and they took him and they imprisoned him until the debt was paid. The board of directors collected money to get that debt paid. Joe Anderson, if it wasn't for Joe Anderson, there is no Mars Hill College. He even built some of the buildings there. So definitely a long history in Madison County. My grandmother grew up in Madison County. She was the first person of color to attend Mars Hill College, which obviously is tough to be the first person to do anything. So I definitely commend her, and I thank her for that work, because the things that she's done, it's allowed us to sit here and have this conversation today. So I'm incredibly grateful for that. She was bused in from Madison County to Asheville growing up to go to school. So she went to Stevens Lee. So she made that long trip on the bus every single day, whereas all the white children were not making that same long trip. So she did that throughout school. I think it's funny. Obviously, my experience is the same, but although I was born in Asheville, I lived in Fletcher pretty much my entire life. So I should have went to Henderson County schools, but I did not. I went through the Asheville City School system. My parents went through that system. It's familiar. It's more diverse, and it's ultimately probably was a better environment for me and my learning. So I went to Classen Elementary, Asheville Middle School, Asheville High School, and I was very privileged to have parents that were able to drive me from Fletcher to Asheville every single day for that education. I grew up in a middle-class family. My family owns a janitorial business that was founded in 1990 and is still going today. So I think that's really phenomenal that we have a Black-owned business that's been going that strong that long. And I'm super grateful and privileged to have that in my life. And I currently work for that business. Along with being mayor and serving on a couple of nonprofit boards, Nevertheless, after high school, I went to UNC-G, which is Greensboro. A double major. I was a major in political science and African American and African diaspora studies. I thought I knew I wanted to do something in politics. I just didn't know what exactly that looked like. I knew I wanted to help people somehow. I thought government was a great way to do that because government to service. So figuring out how we can maybe dismantle some of these systems, how we can serve the people better. Nevertheless, I graduated from UNCG in 2017. And actually, let me step back. Greensboro was like a totally different experience than Asheville. It was so incredibly diverse. There's so many Black and brown people down there. It was like a cultural shock when I went there. And it really opened my eyes to how lack of culture, for lack of a better term, or not diverse, better yet, Asheville really is. But nevertheless, I graduated in 2017. I went to Western Carolina University, got my Master of Public Affairs, which is a degree for folks that want to go into local government, but they want to go into more of the administrative side. So we're talking like a city manager or a county manager, the individuals that implement the policy that decision makers create, so the elected bodies create. I thought I wanted to go that route. But I was interning for, and this is when I was in grad school, I was interning for a local municipality, and they were doing this revitalization project in pretty much beside a predominantly Black community that had been neglected for years and years and years. And now all of a sudden they're doing this revitalization project. And, I had mixed feelings about it because there were other aspects to it. So, I want them to invest in these communities, but I thought some of the things they were doing weren't exactly the best ways to invest in the community. For example, we know that Black and brown people, especially Black folk, have a mistrust of law enforcement, and justly so, given the data and given it from a historical, looking at it from a historical lens. And they were going to build this police station pretty much in the middle of this predominantly Black neighborhood. And, I'm like, these are folk that already don't trust law enforcement. These are folk that are already, I don't know what the data was for that municipality. But, these are folk that are probably already over-policed. If it isn't in this community they're being over-policed, they may be being over-policed in another community, which, maybe not be your fault, but it does impact how these people live and how these people interact in their own communities. And that really actually brings me back to high school and not knowing terms for what was going on then, but knowing these terms now. When I'm in middle school, I'm in high school, and I'm seeing dogs come and they're sniffing around, searching for drugs, and kids are getting arrested for being kids, getting in fights, stuff like that. And, they're going to court, and, I'm seeing what is essentially the school to prison pipeline before my very eyes. I didn't have a definition for it when I was in school, but now I have this definition. But, those are some of the things I go back and I think about when I think about a police station being built in the middle of a predominantly Black community, and school to prison pipeline that I witnessed going through school that kind of led me to where I am today and wanting to be more in that decision maker side of the table instead of the implementation side of the table, because I probably wouldn't feel great implementing policy I didn't agree with. So that's ultimately where I'm at today.
Well, first I should say congratulations on being mayor.
Thank you.
I followed the race in the newspapers. I couldn't vote myself because I'm an Asheville resident. But
sure.
And it's quite an accomplishment for someone so young. But also, I'll say it felt like a particular accomplishment to see a young Black person become the mayor of Fletcher. And so I want to get back to the housing question in particular, because you brought up a pretty specific example, which I think could illustrate some of this, some of those issues really well in terms of what revitalization sometimes means for people. But I also want to just ask you a little bit about your experience in Fletcher, having grown up there, running for mayor. and how people responded to you, what your experience of that was, and not to get into the politics so much of how you won the race, but just a little bit more about that, if you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, for sure. I grew up in a neighborhood with very few Black people. My family was one of those families, obviously. And it's interesting. I didn't actually spend a whole lot of time in Fletcher growing up. Most of my time was spent in Nashville. That's where I went to school. That's where all my friends were. That's where my family business was. That's where I was spending my time. But nevertheless, I knew some people in Fletcher. I knew my neighbors, of course. And when I got to campaign my first time around for town council, it was a really grassroots campaign. And it was 70% of vote, which is phenomenal. I went and knocked on doors. I had a lot of help. People helped make phone calls, write postcards, just do numerous of different campaign-related activities, and it was incredibly successful. And I was incredibly grateful for that. But I think anywhere you go to when you get into the mayor's race, it becomes different. The mayor is seen as like the figurehead, the person everybody's going to go to for if anything goes wrong in the town or the city, wherever you are. And, people really care about that, about the position. They care about a little bit more than just a council member, even though arguably the council member probably has more power than I do as a weak mayor. But nevertheless, people care about that title and they care about what that person is doing. So, my run for mayor, I intended to do the same thing, but this became one of the most divisive, probably the most divisive race in the history of Fletcher, if anybody kept up with it. It ended up being myself against this pastor, and I'm sticking to my guns. I'm doing everything the right way. The things that I did last time, I'm knocking on the doors. I'm, working even harder this time. If it's raining, I'm out knocking on doors, pouring. It doesn't matter. I'm there Saturdays, Sundays, Monday through Friday, every day of the week. I'm out there working. I'm writing postcards. People helping me write postcards, making phone calls and writing letters and putting out door hangers. Every house that I went to, I knocked on thousands of doors, and if people weren't there, I'm leaving them handwritten notes. So I'm really taking my time and doing this the right way. But I think racism reared its ugly head this time around when I was running for mayor. So a couple of days before the election, I've been in pretty much every neighborhood in Fletcher. I've talked to who I could talk to. I've done a social media thing. I've reached out. I did everything I needed to do. And I'm like, okay, well, I just need to be able to remind people to go out and vote. It's an off-year election. So the only thing that's going to be on the ballot is these municipal elections. So, people forget. They don't know, and that's fine. So, I think it's our role a little bit to educate them, and I'm fine to do that. So I'm going out to every door I've been to, and my mom and my dad and my brother, everybody's helping me. I'm putting out door hangers that are saying, hey, come vote for me this day, and this is where you need to go. So I'm doing that Saturday and Sunday, and Monday I take the day off of work to go do that so people can go home and they'll see it. And my mom's helping me. She took the day off as well, so she's somewhere else. And she's in the neighborhood I grew up in, actually, and I'm in a neighborhood not far away. And she calls me and she's like, I think they're putting up flyers about you. And I'm not thinking about anything of it. I'm like, okay. I'm like, well, did you see it? She's like, no, I can't really see what it said. I'm like, okay. She's like, I think that's what's happening. And then when, I'm in the neighborhood, I finally find the flyer and I'm getting to reading it. And I'm like, what is going on here? What we saw were they're called dog whistles, but really it was the whole bullhorn they brought out. They're saying terms like Preston wants racially allocated resources, urbanization, things along those lines. And I'm like, what is going on? Like, and what is it? Particularly what stuck out to me was that racially allocated resources piece. I'm like, what does that look like in 90% white Fletcher even? And we can't do that for one as well. I'm like, you're wrong. These aren't things I'm advocating for. So, it reared its ugly head, but I think it did more harm to the other candidate than good, honestly, which I was happy with. But there were still people. I was out at the polls, greeting people the entire day on election day. There are people bringing it up to me. And they're like, what is this about? And I found myself I had to explain myself for somebody else's actions. And there are people being, not so kind about it. And there's other people like, I know this isn't true. End up being a newspaper and WLOS, and it spread really far on social media. But it was incredibly hurtful, to be honest. But I still got to where I am today, so I'm glad to be here, even though that reared its ugly head.
Thank you for sharing that, Preston, and especially since it was hurtful. And so I appreciate you revisiting that, because it's I think some people, one of the reasons why we continue to hold Building Bridges sessions is because there are some folks who believe that we're in this kind of post-racial society now. I think there are fewer people who believe that after 2020 and after, but there are still some folks, who, when it comes to things like this, might be surprised that racism, takes place, even in majority white towns. So you mentioned growing up in a middle class household, and you also mentioned one of the reasons you decided to run for office having to do with this plan to ostensibly improve the living situation for some Black folks, but it sounds like that plan was enacted without actually talking very much to the Black folks in question. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about your experience with housing. We know that everybody's experience is different, but what you've seen as some of the racialized components of housing where you've grown up, and also, you said you spent a lot of time in Asheville, what you've witnessed and what your perspective is about that.
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of changes, and I've perceived a lot of things over the years. And we can kind of jump around from county to county, talking about what I've seen. In particular, in Asheville, I think. Actually, I won't even say just Asheville. I think West North Carolina, in a lot of areas, in a lot of ways, has prioritized, intentionally so, tourism and those dollars over actual people and actual communities. My dad grew up in the mountainside community, and my grandmother actually lived on Carroll Avenue, and some of my family members still live in that house on Carroll Avenue, which is right by a mountainside. And her home, just thinking about my grandmother's home, at one point it looked very natural there. And now when I go over there, it almost looks unnatural, as in that the area has changed so much. But this same house across from Tri-Stone Church is still there. It's very bizarre to see, honestly. But nevertheless, behind that house used to be mountainside. There's now apartments up there. And I'm not sure exactly the story that happened there. I know it happened when I was a kid, but if I had to make an assumption, I'm sure I displaced a lot of people and destroyed a community. When I look over at the River Arts District, I'm always curious about how that came about. I'm not sure. It feels like they prioritize tourism there as well instead of actual people. And I don't know that for sure. I'm not sure if that's intentional or, some of these unintended consequences of planning. But it feels like even in that instance, it's like my grandmother's house almost now, where what was originally there looks out of place now, and it's weird. And it feels intentional, and those things destroy communities. They invest all these funds around these communities, and it seems like the community continues to shrink and shrink and shrink until it's no longer there and people can't afford to live where they've always lived. It's not attainable. They end up having to move elsewhere, and they're coming out to Henderson County, or my peers that were privileged enough to go to college, they're not able to come back or don't want to come back to Asheville. And they're staying in Greensboro, staying in Charlotte, staying in Raleigh, where there's at least to my understanding, maybe more of upward mobility there for them, unfortunately. And then here, where I interned at the municipality, and I've referenced the police station being built in the middle of this community. I remember talking to some of the administrators. I'm like, look, I mean, y'all are treading in some dangerous waters. I mean, you've got the opportunity to create mass mistrust, and people that, diversity is one of the things that this city's going to value. You might be working against that, and you might be creating more mistrust that already exists in these people's minds, these individuals' minds, these community members' minds. Remember having that conversation, and the individual told me, like, well, we had a couple of community meetings, and some people seem receptive to it, but some people don't. I'm like, well, you should give them all the facts. Let's really talk about this. Let's educate people if they don't understand. A lot of people don't understand local government, and that's okay. And it's our role as elected officials and as administrators to provide this service to the community. That's our role, is to provide a service. We need to make sure we provide that service well. So, I'm seeing the police station being built, and then go one avenue over, and they're revitalizing a portion of the city that's been historically neglected. And, these shops are going up, and it's like these artisan coffee shops and donut shops, and, things that, just weren't originally there. So I'm like, this feels like we're headed towards, my grandmother's house, where it looks, at one point, it looked like it was supposed to be there, but now it looks like it's almost not supposed to be there, even though it was originally there. And it was just a very bizarre feeling. And again, that's why I'm in the position that I'm in now. But, those are some of the things I've just perceived over the years. And that's kind of my vision of what I've seen in my short life, just 27 years, but a lot's changed in that time.
Yeah, I think the pace of change in this area, I mean, I suppose it's true of a lot of places, really seems very fast, for sure. And especially for people who've actually been here their entire lives, it must seem massive. And what I'm hearing from you is that a part of that, is that there were once Black communities that just no longer exist. Because of what I'm sure the people at the time considered progress one way or the other, towards some sort of goal for the area. And so at Building Bridges, we spend weeks on particular topics, and the other topics that we focus on are education and the legal system and healthcare. And I want to invite you to just give your perspective on how those areas might overlap with housing, or share anything you would like. You already mentioned the school to prison pipeline. And we know that, how schools and property taxes and neighborhoods, can work together to work against students of color a lot. And that sounds like something that you witnessed, but I wonder if you have any thoughts on any of those topics and how they overlap, how and where we live.
Yeah, I think education is obviously a big one. I always like to say that I grew up in a middle class family, because I think it's also so often perceived that Black folk are only coming from low income families, and that's just not the case, and that hasn't been the case for me in my life. But the there's concentrated poverty, and that's unfortunately been placed upon the backs of Black folk, where their poverty has been concentrated to one particular area. And you brought up a good point in that property taxes contribute to how much money goes to schools, and you go to school in your neighborhood, right? So, we're getting poorer schools because they're having less funding. The best teachers always, at least I perceive, should be at those schools that need the most help, but that the schools that need the least help. I've always thought that was a really interesting conundrum in terms of healthcare, access to healthcare, food. Both of those seem like deserts in communities sometimes. There is no access to healthy food. There is no access to healthcare. If the access is there, it's almost like it's unattainable. I think we have a huge highlight in how that trust between probably the community as a whole and Mission or HCA now. I mean, that is fractured trust. We don't see a lot of people, anybody for that matter, that are really advocating for Mission or HCA now, and that's unfortunate. And that trust got fractured a bit. But there's so many avenues where housing is connected. I mean, we know if people have full-time housing, they have there's less cost for healthcare, there's less cost for crime. I mean, everything goes down. So, I mean, there's just so many connections to housing and other aspects of our lives.
Well, thank you, Preston. I don't want to take any more of your time. I'm so grateful again for the time you've spent to share your story and your thoughts with us for this and for our Building Bridges session. And I just want to give you the opportunity to share any last words you would like to before we wrap things up.
My last words are, I really appreciate you all having me. And I think the work that you're doing in our communities is incredibly important and incredibly impactful. And I recognize you and I see you and I thank you.
Thank you, Preston. Thank you, Mayor Blakely. And congratulations again. And we appreciate you and the work that you're doing. And thank you again for spending the time.
This has been a production of Building Bridges of Asheville. For more information, please visit our website at bbavl.org.